In 1933, a teenage girl made the fateful decision to murder her own father. And ultimately, she would be sent to state reform school for 6 years. Now, strangely, her mother was also sentenced to 25 years in prison for the same crime. Now, why is that? Well, it so happened that her mother was having an affair and would receive thousands in insurance money should her husband come to an untimely end. So, how did she convince her daughter to commit the crime? In 1956, wealthy heiress Helen Dow Peck bestowed her entire fortune to John Gale Forbes, a man whom she'd never met. And she wasn't the only one who had never met John Gale Forbes, because he didn't exist. So what made this strange woman bequeath her entire fortune to a figment of her imagination? Lastly, in 1935, Mr. Herbert Hurd was driven to kill his wife, Nellie. Why? Well, Nellie had spent months torturing him, quite literally. She was burning him and beating him. Why? Well, she was convinced that he had given $15,000 to some woman that he'd had an affair with. And he wasn't having an affair, and this was all made up. So where did she get that information? Well, it turns out that in all three of these examples, everyone had gotten their information from the same source, the New York Times. Just kidding. No, they'd all been talking to Ouija board.
Welcome to the Woo There It Is podcast.
Now, I don't know if any of you have also been the victim of this lie. When they said that the Parker brothers invented the Ouija board in 1966, that's not really true. I think they patented the Ouija board, but it in itself existed for many years, or some version of a Ouija board, where you have something like the wooden planchette, something that slides on a surface to different letters or numbers or something, some way to communicate with people. So human beings can communicate with non-human entities. This has been going on for many years. And it's actually kind of an unknown history, because I know in the book that I read, Ouija, the Most Dangerous Game, he says that this whole concept of using some device to draw on a surface in order to communicate with the dead, that's been around since at least as far back as 540 BC. And the prevailing wisdom about Ouija boards is to stay away from them, that they're demonic. And I don't disagree with that. I think that's probably a good idea. But after reading this book, I realized that what he's talking about, this sort of communication with the other side, it's very similar to other forms of communicating with other side. It's just sort of another tool. And I know some people use something called automatic writing. I think it was made famous by Neil Donald Walsh. He used automatic writing to write the book series Conversations with God. And he claims, and I believe him, he claims that he was just suffering deeply one day. His whole life was in shambles. And he was like, why is this happening? And he said that his hand just starts writing stuff. So it's sort of like independent of him. It's like his hand's working without his mind really telling it what to do. And it's also similar to channeling, I think. When you kind of go into a trance and you start to say things and even do things that you aren't really doing. It's somebody else coming through you, some other entity. So I think those are all kind of in line with the same thing, but Ouija boards in particular get a bad rap. Maybe they should. But one guy that I found, his name is Colton Cato. Some of you may know who he is. He has a YouTube channel called Colton's Unknown Encounters. And he says that when he was very young, like maybe 11 or 12, he and some of his friends decided to sneak out and go use an Ouija board at this location. It was outside near where they lived that was pretty much known to be haunted. So they all went out and they played with the Ouija board and they were all getting freaked out. I don't know if anything specific happened, but he said that after that, one of the friends, they all decided to pack it up and go. And he said that one of his friends was just not the same. Just sort of, normally was chatty, happy, talkative guy and kid. And now he was just very reserved and quiet. And then he said that this friend didn't show up to school. And literally, this is really traumatic. But within a week, that friend of his, had offed himself. But let's talk about what happened in Buffalo, New York in 1930. So there was a woman, her name was Nancy Bowen, and she was a Seneca tribal shaman. And she had recently lost her husband, Charlie. And she was really, obviously, very much grieving this loss. And she went to her friend named Lila Jimerson. And Lila was like, well, I mean, maybe we could communicate with Charlie through a Ouija board. And so Nancy was like, sure, I'll try anything. Pretty soon they're playing when the Ouija board spells out, "They killed me." So Nancy's like, who? And the Ouija board spells out, "Clotilda." Who the hell is that? And then the Ouija board says, 576 Riley Street. What? Nancy, this is very odd because Nancy did not know anybody named Clotilda, and she definitely wasn't aware of that particular address. So this is very strange, but she just kind of ignored it. And then within a few days, she received a letter from someone calling themselves Mrs. Dooley. And Mrs. Dooley told Nancy that Clotilda was a white witch. And she had essentially killed Charlie, maybe had hexed Charlie so that he died because she was jealous of him. He was also a shaman. She was jealous of Charlie because his magic worked better than hers. She wasn't a very good witch, apparently. And so finally, Nancy was so pissed about this, that there was this evil white witch who lived in her town who murdered her husband, that she went to go have a conversation with this Clotilda woman at 576 Riley Street. And when I say conversation, I mean she showed up at Clotilda's door with a hammer and chloroform. So I'm not sure much of a conversation was had. As you might have guessed, things didn't go very well for Clotilda, and she wound up dead. And it was her 14-year-old son who found her dead on the floor when he got home from school. Things get a little bit weird from here because it was not Nancy who got arrested for Clotilda's death. Instead, Lila Jimerson was the first person that police questioned for the murder of Clotilda. So why is that? Well, first let's find out who this Clotilda, her last name was Marchand was, Clotilda Marchand. Well, she was an artist and she was a mother. And she was also the wife of a well-known sculptor. His name was Henri Marchand. And he'd actually studied under the famous artist Rodin. And Henri would create these Native American dioramas. That was what he did. That was the art that he created. And he had to work with a lot of people from the Seneca tribes. He would have them be models for him as he would create these dioramas. And these dioramas would be more accurate, he felt, if these Native American Seneca women would be topless in these dioramas when they were modeling for him. And in order to get them to be comfortable being topless, it also was quite necessary for him to have sex with them. And so this is all what he testified later on in court. So he said, I have had sex with countless numbers of women, all in the name of art. So as you might have guessed, Lila was the first person suspected of this murder of Henri's wife, because Lila was one of the women that Henri was sleeping with. And as soon as she was arrested, she just started throwing everyone under the bus. And she told about Nancy Bowen. She said, oh yeah, I think she did it. And she also said that Henri was partially to blame because he had implied that she murdered his wife. He said he'd once told her, I am growing tired of my wife. There's kind of a universe of extrapolation that's required to go from I'm tired of my wife to kill my wife. But either way, Jimerson wasn't actually guilty of anything illegal, just lying. So she was acquitted and freed of any crime. But here's the thing, she was guilty. I think she was an accessory. Because literally on the day of, she knew that Nancy Bowen was going to go and murder Clotilda. And so she asked Henri, hey, to take her for a ride, a nice drive out on the town to get him away from the house. So I think she was an accessory, but somehow she was freed of any crime. Meanwhile, after spending 1 year in prison, so all of this is coming out in trial, and Nancy, having, done the hammering, has been in prison. And at the end of a year in prison, after all of these details come out, that Nancy was lied to, that she didn't know that Clotilda wasn't actually a white witch who'd murdered her husband, Nancy's freed. She's only charged with manslaughter, and she's freed based on the time that she's served. And I don't know if it's just me, but it seems to me that even if she was lied to, even if she committed this crime under false pretenses, it's still first-degree premeditated murder. She showed up at this woman's house with a hammer and bashed her skull in and then stuffed chloroform down her throat. I kind of feel like she's really guilty of first-degree murder. Yes, it was under false pretenses, but there's still fucking due process. You don't just go and murder people because you were lied to, because you think they're bad people. It's still a crime. So I don't really understand what justice was like back in 1930, but that's what ended up happening. And meanwhile, this is all, okay, y'all, I'm sorry, none of this is woo. I don't think anything, this is woo. I think Lila just moved the planchette to say whatever she wanted it to say. And meanwhile, Henri, whose wife has now been conveniently removed from his life, he marries his wife's 18-year-old niece. So Lila never had a shot. This all was the most baseless murder. Now, if Henri knew what was happening the entire time, if he really did put Lila up to it, then how horrible that he got away with it. But nothing was ever said to make it seem like he knew what was going on. So I don't know. But if he did, then what a jerk. He ended up living a full and happy life with an 18-year-old wife. Ugh. On July 12th, 1912, Mrs. Emily Hutchings and her friend Pearl Curran, they went over to their friend's house to play with a Ouija board. And Emily thought that it was so cool because apparently one of her dead relatives seemed to come through and actually speak with her. So she went out and she bought her own board, and then she convinced Pearl to use it with her. And they would do this on and off for a while, but then Pearl's father died. And after that, Pearl didn't want to use the Ouija board anymore. So it's unclear of any of the details here, but it kind of sounds like Pearl thought something that she had invited with this Ouija board session had led to the death of her father, possibly. It kind of seemed like that. But eventually, Emily was able to convince Pearl to get back at it and use the Ouija board still. Then roughly a year after they had started, in July of 1913, the Ouija board spontaneously spelled out the following. Many moons ago I lived, again I come, Patience Worth my name. And it was Pearl who was spelling all of that out, seemingly spontaneously. At least that's what she claims. And it wasn't long after that before volumes of work just seemed to flow through Pearl Curran as she is sort of dictating these words from some character, some entity who calls itself Patience Worth. And she wrote tons of prose, poetry, short stories, plays, novels, and you can actually find some of her books on Amazon. This is all true. And one of the most popular books that was written by Patience Worth, channeled through Pearl Curran, was this one called The Sorry Tale. And it was about the life of Jesus Christ. And you can find critics at the time who really praised this work. They thought it was quite amazing. And if Pearl Curran was just putting on a show but doing all of the writing herself, she was pretty ballsy about it, because she would literally invite people to come over and watch her as she would channel Patience Worth writing out Ouija board stuff. And I'm pretty sure she would even take requests from them. So people would say, hey, would you write me a poem about Halloween, how amazing Halloween is, or something? And immediately she would just go to work and she would write out a really well-formed poem, which I don't know that many people can do that easily. But at one time, Patience Worth was stumped. And this is when somebody said, you know what? A lot of children's bedtime stories are a little bit morbid. Like the one that goes, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. That's kind of a crazy thing to tell a kid. Who came up with that shit? And so they wanted Patience to come up with a new children's nighttime rhyme to say before they go to bed that wasn't so morbid. And this was the first time that she was stumped. And so she ended up not coming up with one that day, but then later on came up with this. I, thy child, forever play about thy knees at close of day. Within thy arms I now shall creep and learn thy wisdom while I sleep. Amen. I don't think that's bad, actually. So who was Patience Worth? She claimed that she was born in Dorsetshire, England in 1649, and that she migrated to America in 1694, and then was killed by Native Americans. And that's all she would reveal. And so what was the relationship that Patience had with Pearl Curran, who was basically channeling her through the Ouija board? And for the most part, they seemed friendly, but every once in a while, if Pearl kind of interpreted things that Patience was saying incorrectly, or even tried to interpret them at all with her own opinions or thoughts, then Patience would get really caustic with her and be kind of mean. Not really behavior you would expect from a higher order being, unfortunately. And Patience also encouraged Pearl to adopt a child. And so Pearl and her husband, who was totally on board with this by now, adopted a kid. And they named the child Patience Worth. But then in 1922, Pearl became pregnant with her first child. And not long after she got pregnant, her husband and her mom both got sick and died. And right around then, she sort of started taking less interest in Patience Worth, and the public became less interested, and the whole phenomenon just kind of died down. And Pearl Curran ended up dying in 1939, many years later. But here's a weird footnote to the story. So remember Pearl's friend, Mrs. Emily Hutchings? And she was the one who was really gung-ho about the Ouija board from the very beginning. Well, she supposedly started communicating with Mark Twain via the Ouija board. And she claimed to have written an entire book that was by Mark Twain. It's called Jap Heron. And that's also one that you can find on Amazon. And she even worked with a publisher to publish it. as being written by Mark Twain, but Twain's publisher stepped in and was like, no, you don't have the right to do this since Mark Twain is dead. And so that's kind of weird. It kind of seems like, is she making it up because she sees Pearl getting all this attention? It really calls into question kind of the entire phenomenon. Like maybe they were both charlatans. It's kind of hard to tell, but I think it would be very difficult to come up with all the poetry, all the prose, everything that she did in that short period of time, if there isn't some sort of external powerful influence. Last story. On February 13th in 2001, 52-year-old Carol Sue Elvacher and her 34-year-old daughter, Tammy Roach, and Tammy's 2 children, ages 10 and 15, all decided to play an innocent game on the Ouija board. And at some point, Carol Sue, who's the grandma, became convinced by the Ouija board that Tammy's husband, Brian Roach, was evil and needed to die. And so she very calmly and rationally picked up a butcher knife and went and stabbed Brian in the chest while he was asleep. Meanwhile, she was also told by the Ouija board that her 10-year-old grandkid also needed to die. So she started chasing that kid around with a knife. That's when Tammy, Carol Sue's daughter, and also the mother of the 10-year-old, intervened and took the knife away from her and hid it somewhere. And then was like, oh, let's all pile in the car and just get out of here. That was what they did. She didn't call the ambulance or anything to help maybe try to save Brian Roach's life. No, they just left the house. So this is very odd. But Carol Sue, meanwhile, even though Tammy has convinced her, let's just get out of here, Carol Sue, unfortunately, is the one driving the car. And according to this article, Carol Sue was still convinced that everyone in the car needed to die. It was really important that they all die. And so she purposely got the car into an accident, a car wreck, but that was ineffective. So she wrecked the car, but everyone survived, thank God. And then she tried to push the 15-year-old into oncoming traffic. I don't know what came over this woman. It's very confusing. All of this from a Ouija board? Like, what the hell? And then, so now it's very clear to me that she lost her marbles totally. I mean, it should have been clear earlier, but now it's really clear. She strips off all of her clothes and goes running into the woods to hide. And that's where she was found and charged and convicted. But the cops even considered Tammy to be an accessory to the crime because they felt like she didn't really step in the way when Carol Sue was stabbing Brian Roach to death. So that part of the story is very confusing. Was that somehow premeditated? Was it desire? Like, did Tammy want that? It's hard to say, but that's how the police saw it. But what's crazy about the whole story in the article itself, the assistant district attorney, Brett Burns, the article quotes him as saying, "It's amazing how the grandmother was able to let this Ouija board consume her life and how she was able to brainwash her daughter and granddaughters." I mean, the way the article is written is that they just picked it up just then. So, but that implies like this long-standing obsession with a Ouija board and this huge possession event. So it's very vaguely written, but this is a pretty popular story too. So a lot of people knew about it. So I don't know why the details aren't more clear. But here's an interesting addendum that I thought was possibly relevant. So Brian Roach, when he was 19 years old, was actually voted in as mayor of the town they lived in. It was a small town called Minco, Oklahoma. But his political career was actually cut short when he bankrupted the city after pouring all of the city's funds into a theme park called Ice Town.
You're Benji Wyatt?
Just kidding. Just kidding. That's Parks and Recreation. But he was voted in as mayor. That is true. And then he was on city council for a couple of years before leaving public service. And so when he was murdered, he was only in his 30s. But my thought was that this article was so vaguely written, and this quote from the district attorney about Carol Sue being brainwashed and also brainwashing her daughter and granddaughters, that just made so little sense to me that I also kind of wonder, was that a cover for something deeper? Did they not want the true reality because these people work in public office, and perhaps Brian Roach had friends in public office, that maybe they wanted to cover something up? It's hard to say. So that story is either very woo, i.e. some woman got immediately possessed by a demon and wanted to murder everybody in her family, or it's not woo at all, and it's just a classic tale of small town city corruption. But anyway, with that, I will leave you all to ponder. Thank you for joining the Woo There It Is podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this special Halloween-themed episode featuring Ouija boards. I'll see you guys next time.